I never imagined I'd be the one in this position. I always thought I had it all figured out, what I wanted, how I'd get it, and who I'd share it with. But here I am, sitting in this tiny apartment with past due notices scattered across the table, no way to pay rent, and nothing to show for the so called plan I'd carefully crafted for my life. You see, I used to have this perfect idea of what a relationship should look like. My mom always told me, find a provider before you get too old. That idea stuck with me, and I told myself that I'd never make the same mistake I did with Darren. Darren was a disaster, couldn't hold a job, couldn't manage money, and left me with more debt than I ever thought possible. So when I met Trevor, I knew he was different. He had his life together in ways I could only dream of, his nice watch, his tailored suit, the way he carried himself. Trevor wasn't like Darren. Trevor had a plan, and I was sure he was the kind of guy I'd been waiting for. At first, it felt so natural. We met at Ashley's housewarming party, and I could tell right away he was the type of guy who would be a provider. I wasn't shy about showing off my career achievements, my promotion at work, how independent I was. I didn't need a man to take care of me, but it was nice to know one could if I wanted him to. Trevor was smooth, and I liked the way he made me feel, like I could just relax, that I didn't have to worry about money anymore. In the first few weeks, everything was perfect. He paid for every dinner, every date, every outing. I didn't have to reach for my wallet once, and that felt good. I liked the idea of someone else handling the bills for a change, of not worrying about whether I'd make it to the next paycheck. It felt easy, like I finally got what I'd been working toward for so long. Trevor was my ticket out of that financial chaos I'd been in with Darren. He didn't need me to prove anything. He made me feel like I was worth more than the mess I'd been with Darren. But as the weeks went by, I started feeling a shift. It wasn't big at first, just small things that I told myself were normal. Trevor would look at me differently when I declined his advances. I'd be too tired from work or just not in the mood, but I could see the frustration building in his eyes. It wasn't like he was pressuring me, not really, but I could feel the weight of his expectations. He was providing, and he expected something in return. And if I'm being honest, it made me feel dirty, like I owed him. But I refused to admit that. I told myself that it was just how things worked. He was the provider, and I was supposed to benefit from it. By the time we hit month 3, I was practically living at his place. I didn't need to stay in my apartment with its broken heater and drafts when his place was cozy and warm. Why pay rent when I could stay with him? It just made sense. And it wasn't like I was freeloading. I'd still go to work during the day, but I started spending more and more time at his place, feeling secure and comfortable, not having to think about my financial problems. Trevor even gave me a key, which I thought meant something, like it was his way of showing that he wanted me around permanently. But what I didn't realize was that by staying there so much, I was already starting to give up control of my own life. Trevor wasn't asking for much. He wasn't forcing me into anything. But the more I accepted his gifts, his dinners, his generosity, the more I started feeling like I had to give something back. The problem was, I wasn't sure what I had to offer. I wasn't contributing to his life the way he was to mine. I had become dependent on him, emotionally, financially, physically, and that's when the guilt started creeping in. I pushed the thoughts aside, telling myself that relationships were give and take. I wasn't just taking, though. I told myself I was providing other things: emotional support, companionship, making his home feel warm and inviting. But I knew deep down that it wasn't enough. The tension kept building like an unsaid thing between us, and even though I didn't want to admit it, part of me began to feel like I was using him. Maybe that's when the whole thing started to fall apart. The worst part was, I knew I could keep this charade going. I knew how to make it look like I had it all together, like I was contributing in ways that mattered. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I kept telling myself I'd find a job, eventually. I'd take care of things, just as soon as I had a little more time. But I wasn't doing anything. I was waiting for him to keep providing, and that's when I started to see the cracks in the foundation. I was at Ashley's housewarming party when I first saw him. He stood across the room, casually leaning against the wall, a glass of wine in his hand, chatting with a few friends. The moment our eyes met, it felt like something shifted. I didn't know what it was, but there was something in the way. He looked at me, confident, sure of himself, but not in an arrogant way, just solid. I could tell he was different. His smile was easy, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. He was wearing a sharp suit, the kind that screamed, "I've got my life together." The way he carried himself, like he didn't have to prove anything, made him stand out in a room full of people who were still figuring things out. He was tall, with neatly styled hair and a watch that looked expensive. It was obvious that money wasn't an issue for him, and that was exactly what I needed to see. I walked over, pretending to be casual, throwing in some small talk, laughing a little too loud at his jokes. I wanted to come across as independent, successful, like I didn't need anything from him. I was doing well at work, a promotion in the bag, but I wasn't about to admit to myself or anyone else that deep down, I was just looking for someone who could take care of me. We talked for hours that night. The conversation was effortless, and every word he said made me feel more intrigued. He seemed to understand the world in a way that I didn't. Like he wasn't struggling with the things I had been. He wasn't looking for someone to pull him up. I could tell he was looking for someone who could keep up. And for the first time in a while, I felt like I just might have met the perfect match. Our first few dates were everything I had been missing. It felt like a dream come true, like a movie I had watched over and over in my mind. Trevor always chose the best places, restaurants I wouldn't have dared to pick for myself. The kind of places where the entrees weren't just fancy words on a menu, but actual meals. He paid without hesitation, without making me feel like I needed to reach for my wallet, even though I always pretended I was about to. I'd let my hand hover over my purse just to make it seem like I was ready to contribute, but Trevor always beat me to it. His generosity didn't just make me feel special, it made me feel safe in a way I hadn't in a long time. We'd talk for hours, laughing about silly things, sharing stories of our pasts. I'd talk about my job, how things were going well at work, and how I was pushing hard to move up. I mentioned the promotion I was up for, just enough to sound like I had it all together. But what I didn't say was how much of a struggle it had been. I didn't mention how close I was to maxing out my credit cards, or how I had to keep borrowing from my savings to cover bills. He didn't need to know about that. In fact, I made sure he didn't. I didn't want Trevor to see the cracks in my life. I wanted him to see a woman who had her career on track, a woman who didn't need anyone but still appreciated the finer things. I kept my true financial situation hidden, and it felt like I was playing a role that was more polished than who I really was. I told myself that it didn't matter, that the real me was the confident, career-driven woman I showed him, not the one who struggled just to keep the lights on. After all, he was offering me everything I thought I needed: stability, luxury, and freedom from worry. As the weeks went on, I could see Trevor's attraction deepening. He'd ask about my day, listen to my stories, and compliment my independence. I made sure to highlight how I didn't rely on anyone, how I made my own decisions, paid my own bills, and was just as comfortable in a dive bar as I was at an upscale restaurant. The truth was, I was desperate to be with someone who could provide, who would make it easy for me to live comfortably without worrying about how I'd pay rent or cover my expenses. In my mind, this was what relationships were supposed to be. Men like Trevor provided, and women like me benefited from it. It wasn't about taking advantage, it was just how things worked. That's what I told myself anyway. I had a clear set of beliefs. Men were supposed to provide. That's how it was in the movies, how it was in every relationship I'd ever seen growing up. And here I was, living out that very script, with Trevor as my leading man. I figured if he was willing to pay for everything, I might as well let him. I deserved it, didn't I? But looking back, there were signs, small red flags I chose to ignore. Trevor never asked for much in return, but I could feel the unspoken expectations between us. The quiet moments when I didn't offer to help out, when I didn't offer to pay for the dinner after he always did. He never said anything, but the pressure built in ways I wasn't willing to acknowledge. It was in his smile that lingered just a second too long when I declined a second drink. or in the way his hand rested on my back just a little too firmly. I could tell he was beginning to expect something more, though he never said it outright. I told myself it didn't matter. He liked me, and that was enough. He was providing what I needed, and I was offering the best version of myself, one that didn't need help, didn't need anyone. He was just lucky to have me. That's how I saw it, even if I never said it aloud. I believed I was worth the effort, that I deserved to be taken care of. I didn't have to give him anything in return except my company and affection. That was the deal, right? At the time, it all seemed perfect. Trevor seemed happy, I felt safe, and the lifestyle I had always wanted was finally within my reach. But even then, deep down, something wasn't quite right. And I should have known that nothing comes for free. Not really, but I couldn't see it. Not yet. It wasn't long before I made the decision to move in with Trevor. His place was everything I wanted: spacious, modern, and clean. The apartment had a view of the city skyline, and it felt like stepping into a world I'd only dreamed of. It wasn't just the space itself that attracted me, it was the stability it represented. Trevor's life, his apartment, the way everything was set up, it all screamed comfort and security. I didn't have to worry about things breaking down or wondering if I'd have enough to cover rent. I was finally where I needed to be, or at least I told myself I was. It felt easy at first. I wasn't just moving in, I was moving up. I brought over a few things, my favorite clothes, my books, and slowly I started spending more nights at his place. Why stay in my tiny, cold apartment when his place was warm and luxurious? It just made sense, and it felt like I was sharing a part of myself with him, even though deep down, I knew I was benefiting more than I was contributing. But I told myself that was okay. After all, wasn't that the point? Wasn't I supposed to enjoy the perks of being with someone who could provide? But as the days turned into weeks, something started to shift. I didn't notice it at first, or maybe I didn't want to. The more time I spent with him, the more dependent I became, not just financially, but emotionally too. I relied on him for the little things. When I was stressed, he was the one I turned to. When I needed reassurance, he was the one who gave it. Slowly, I realized I was starting to lean on him for everything, even my happiness. I wasn't just his partner, I was becoming someone who needed him. And that feeling, while comforting at first, began to make me feel like I had no control over my own life anymore. It wasn't just the emotional weight. It was the unspoken expectation that I started to feel from him, that nagging feeling that things weren't as equal as they had been. Trevor didn't ask for much, not really, but I could sense that he was starting to want more. More from me, that is. He'd make comments. Small things like, "You're staying over a lot now," or "We should plan to spend more time together on weekends." At first, I brushed them off, thinking he was just being thoughtful, but the more he said it, the more I realized it wasn't just about spending time together. It was about him expecting something in return for all he was doing for me. The pressure started to build, and I felt it in the small ways he began to act differently. Sometimes, when we were out, I noticed the way he looked at me, waiting for me to offer to pay for something, anything. It wasn't that he demanded it, but I could see the silent judgment in his eyes when I didn't. There were moments when I pulled away, when I wasn't as affectionate as he wanted me to be, and I felt him withdraw slightly, though he never said a word. But the distance was there, palpable in the air between us. I hated the guilt that started to bubble up, but I pushed it down every time. This was how relationships worked, right? He was the provider, and I was the one who received. It wasn't like I wasn't giving anything in return. I offered him my companionship, my affection, my love. That had to be enough. But deep down, I knew I wasn't truly contributing in the way he might want me to. I wasn't offering much more than my presence, and that started to feel inadequate. Yet every time the thought crept in, I brushed it aside. I told myself that this was how it was supposed to be. This was normal. I began to realize, though, that I was losing a part of myself. My independence, the thing I'd always prided myself on, was slipping away. I wasn't the strong, self-sufficient woman I had been when we first met. Now I was someone who relied on him for everything: his stability, his support, his validation. And that thought terrified me, but I refused to confront it. I wanted to keep the illusion of the perfect relationship, where I didn't have to work as hard, where everything came easy. But deep down, I knew the balance had shifted, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that it hadn't. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Trevor's voice was tight, controlled. It's like I'm the only one holding everything up. I've been paying for everything, and I just can't keep going like this. Not when you're not doing your part. My stomach dropped. I looked at him, trying to read his face, but I already knew what he was getting at. The last few weeks had felt different, distant, strained, but I thought it was just a phase, maybe a misunderstanding. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Trevor sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm the one covering all the bills, making all the decisions, and you're not contributing. You stay here all the time, but you don't pay for anything. I'm not asking for a lot, but this isn't fair." My heart raced. "I don't owe you anything," I shot back quickly, my tone defensive. "I didn't ask you to pay for everything, and I didn't ask you to take care of me." My words felt hollow, even to me, but I couldn't back down now. "You don't have to ask. I do it because I care," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "But this isn't just about the money, it's everything. I feel like I'm carrying the weight of this relationship on my own, and it's wearing me down." I crossed my arms over my chest, refusing to let him see how much this hurt. "So what? You want me to pay for stuff just to keep the balance?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what relationships are about? You think just because you pay for things, I owe you something in return?" Trevor paused, his expression softening for a second, but then he shook his head. "It's not about the money, it's about respect, about feeling like we're in this together, but it feels like you're just taking." I could feel the guilt creeping in, but I quickly pushed it away. "I'm here, aren't I? I care about you. I don't need to contribute in the way you think I do." I was grasping for anything to keep the conversation from going any further, but deep down, I knew I was just trying to justify what I'd been doing all along. The tension between us was palpable now. After the argument, things weren't the same. Trevor had been distant, not the same affectionate guy I'd met weeks ago. He still took me out to dinner, but it wasn't the same. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. I could feel his frustration in the air, like it was thick and suffocating. He hadn't said anything outright, but the way he avoided eye contact or made little remarks here and there was enough for me to realize he was pulling away. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing. I could handle this. I could fix it. I began to notice the small ways he was starting to detach. He would come home late more often, spending hours at the office. When we were together, the conversations were forced, filled with empty pleasantries instead of the warmth and ease they once had. But I couldn't admit to myself that I was losing him, so I pretended I didn't care. I focused on the little things, the moments I could control. I knew how to play the game, though. I began to use what I had, my body, my attention, as a way to keep him close. The moments we spent together became more about appeasing him than anything else. I told myself it wasn't manipulation, it was just giving him what he wanted so he wouldn't pull away completely. I could feel the power shifting in my hands. If I kept him satisfied, kept him interested, I could still control how things went. He didn't have to know I was giving less and less emotionally, that I wasn't offering anything more than physical attention. It was a calculated move, one I told myself was necessary. But somewhere deep down, I knew I was losing control. I could feel the cracks in the foundation, but I refused to acknowledge them. I convinced myself that if I kept things up, kept pretending everything was fine, he would fall back in line. But even as I tried to cling to that illusion, part of me knew it wouldn't be enough. The balance had already shifted, and I was too afraid to admit it. I heard Trevor's voice before I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a casual phone call, something work-related or a quick chat with a friend. But as I got closer to the door, I could make out his words more clearly. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm being used. She's not contributing at all, and it's starting to feel like I'm just an ATM to her. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I didn't move, not because I didn't want to hear, but because I couldn't bring myself to walk away. He kept talking. I've been covering everything: rent, bills, groceries, and she's just coasting. I care about her, but it feels like she's taking advantage of me. I couldn't process it. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I thought I could justify everything, that I was still offering something in return: my attention, my love. But here it was. The truth, raw and ugly. I had been using him. It wasn't just about the dinners or the nights spent in his place. It was deeper than that. I had let myself rely on him, not just for the material things, but for my own comfort, my own sense of security. Trevor didn't even know I was listening. His voice grew quieter, more resigned. I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't feel respected. I'm not asking for her to pay me back, but I need more than this. I can't keep giving without receiving anything. And then I heard him say it, something I never thought would come out of his mouth. I think it's time we end things. The world tilted beneath me. I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation. My mind was spinning. He was leaving. He was done. All the walls I had built, the illusion of control I had over the situation, were crumbling. I thought I could keep pretending, keep getting by. But now, he saw it. He saw through me. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to face the truth of what I had become. I don't know how to explain the feeling of waking up to an empty apartment, knowing I'm alone, knowing everything has changed. The bills were piling up, and I couldn't remember the last time I had enough money in my account to cover rent. The weight of it all felt suffocating. Trevor had always taken care of the things I couldn't: rent, groceries, the little luxuries I had come to expect without question. And now, with him gone, I didn't know where to turn. I tried to convince myself I could handle it, that I could pick up the pieces on my own, but every time I looked at my bank account, the reality slapped me in the face. I had no savings, no cushion to fall back on. I was living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet, and no matter how hard I worked, it didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. But it wasn't just the money that hurt. It was the emotional toll. Trevor was gone, and I felt abandoned. All those promises we made, all the plans we talked about, none of it mattered anymore. I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, wondering if I could have said something differently, done something to stop it. It didn't help. I felt stupid for believing he would never walk away, for thinking I could get away with taking so much without ever giving back. I knew I had to fix it, but I didn't know how. I started reaching out to him, doing everything I could to make him miss me. I posted pictures on social media, hanging out with friends, acting like I was fine, but deep down, I knew I wasn't fooling anyone, especially not myself. I kept thinking if I made him jealous, if I showed him what he was missing, maybe he would come back. Maybe he'd forget everything and remember why he wanted me in the first place. But the more I tried to regain control, the more I realized something. I wasn't just losing him. I was losing myself. I didn't know who I was anymore, not without him, not without the comfort of someone else taking care of everything. I began questioning everything I had done, the choices I made, the way I had relied on him, and I hated myself for it. I sat in my small apartment, staring at the bills scattered on the table. The weight of them felt heavier than ever. For the first time, I let myself really look at my life. All of it. My choices, my behavior, everything I'd done to get here. And in that moment, everything hit me. I wasn't just dealing with a breakup. I was dealing with a pattern of using people, using them for their stability, for their financial security, and I had done it for years without even realizing it. I had always told myself I wasn't like the women who relied on a man for everything. I prided myself on being strong, independent. But the truth was, I hadn't been independent at all. I'd been looking for someone to take care of me, someone to handle the things I didn't want to deal with. I hadn't been offering anything of equal value in return, emotionally or financially. I had used Trevor just like I had used others before him, and now he was gone. The realization hit me harder than any rejection or heartbreak ever could. It wasn't just about losing him, it was about understanding the damage I had caused, not just to him, but to myself. I had built a life based on the idea that I could find someone to make it all easier. I thought love meant comfort, not effort, but now, with nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and empty space where he once was, I realized how wrong I had been. I had been so caught up in getting what I wanted that I didn't even see how it was breaking me down from the inside out. I had let myself become someone I didn't even recognize, someone who took without giving, who manipulated without feeling. And that wasn't who I wanted to be anymore. I knew I had to change, and it wasn't going to be easy. There was no quick fix, no magic solution to make things right. But in this quiet, painful moment, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let this be my life anymore. I wasn't going to keep looking for someone else to save me. I had to save myself. It would take time. Time to rebuild my finances. Time to rebuild my sense of self. But I was ready to start. The path forward wasn't clear. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew I had to. For the first time in a long while, I had a plan. A real one. It was time to face the consequences of my actions, to own up to the mess I had made. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward becoming someone I could respect again. I woke up that morning with a different feeling. There was no magic switch, no sudden epiphany, but something inside me had shifted. I couldn't keep living like this, relying on others to fill the gaps in my life. It was time to take control, to fix the mess I had created, not just with Trevor, but with myself. The first step wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the job of my dreams or the life I imagined. It was getting out of bed, putting on a clean shirt, and starting somewhere. I dusted off my resume and started applying to every job I could find. I didn't care if it was minimum wage, if it was something I wasn't passionate about. I needed stability. I needed something to get me back on track. I couldn't expect anyone else to do it for me anymore. The first few weeks were brutal. The rejections kept piling up. I couldn't even get a decent interview, and I felt like I was running in circles. The weight of my past mistakes felt heavy, and there were days I didn't even want to get out of bed. I felt isolated, alone, and like I was falling behind. It was hard to ignore the doubts that crept into my mind. Was I capable of change? Could I really do this? But slowly, little by little, things started to improve. I got a job. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I could pay my bills without feeling that crushing weight of debt hanging over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was earning something on my own, building my life from the ground up. And as the days passed, something else changed. I started to understand relationships differently. They weren't about who provided what or who depended on whom. They were about balance, mutual respect, and giving without keeping score. I wasn't the same person who had relied on someone else for everything. I knew now that a healthy relationship meant two people who stood beside each other, not one who carried the other. It wasn't a perfect journey, but I was on the right path. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was becoming someone I could finally be proud of.